You are a Roman guard standing outside a sealed chamber in Alexandria. Behind that door is Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, Pharaoh, last ruler of the Ptolemaic line, one of the most politically dangerous women in the ancient world. She has been locked inside for days. Sometimes you hear movement, soft footsteps on stone, the rustle of fabric. Once or twice a voice, not screaming, not begging, speaking quietly, as if someone else is in the room with her, though you know for certain she is alone. And before we go any further, you need to understand something. Almost everything people think they know about Cleopatra's death is probably wrong. The romantic version, the asp hidden in a basket of figs, the beautiful queen drifting peacefully into death on a couch, while loyal attendants weep around her. That is almost certainly a later simplification, a perfect ending for legend, a terrible ending for history. What actually happened in Alexandria between August 1st and August 12th, 30 BCE, was much colder than romance, and much more revealing about how Roman power really worked. This is not just a story about suicide, it is a story about controlled humiliation, psychological pressure, and the destruction of agency. Because the real question is not how Cleopatra died, it is why Octavian needed her to die in a very specific way, and why he spent days trying to make sure that happened. If this is the kind of history you want, the part beneath the myth, subscribe to History Digger right now. This channel is built for stories exactly like this one, where the official narrative survives because it is elegant, while the truth survives only in fragments. Now let's go back to the first day, August 1st, 30 BCE. Inside a tomb she had built for herself, Mark Antony was dying. He had fallen on his own sword after being falsely told that Cleopatra was already dead. Except she was not dead. She had barricaded herself inside her mausoleum, with 2 loyal attendants, and as much treasure as she could move. The building stood near the temple of Isis. Heavy stone, high walls, narrow access, designed less like a grave and more like a final fortress. Cleopatra understood something Roman historians often underplay. In a world where rulers were dragged from sanctuaries, mocked in streets, and strangled in prisons, death itself required defenses. Antony was brought to the base of the tomb, bleeding and barely conscious. His men begged Cleopatra to open the doors. She refused. That detail shocks modern audiences until you understand the timing. Octavian's forces were moments away. Open the doors, and Roman soldiers enter with them. Open the doors, and Antony dies in her arms. But she loses everything else immediately. So according to Plutarch, Cleopatra and her women lowered ropes from an upper opening and hauled Antony upward by force. Think about what that means physically. A dying man, armor, blood, dead weight, women dragging him through a high aperture into a stone chamber while he was still alive. His blood reportedly streaked the walls as they pulled him inside. That is how Antony entered the tomb. Not ceremonially, not gracefully, dragged upward into the place where he would die. He died there in Cleopatra's arms. The sources preserve his final words in different forms, but the essence remains. Do not pity me. I was a Roman defeated only by another Roman. He died with meaning still intact. Cleopatra had almost no time to grieve, because Octavian's forces arrived, and here is where the first myth breaks. Octavian did not simply batter down the tomb. He did not rush in blindly. He did not treat Cleopatra like a cornered enemy, to be physically overwhelmed. He sent a message. That matters, because from the first hour, what he wanted was not her death. It was her controlled survival. A messenger approached with assurances. Terms could be discussed. Her children's future could be considered. Caesar, meaning Octavian in the language of his authority, wished to negotiate. Cleopatra refused to open the doors. She spoke through a narrow opening, demanding guarantees, especially for her children. And while she was speaking, Octavian's men were climbing the outside. They entered through the same upper access point through which Antony had just been hauled. That is how they took her, by surprise. Not from the front, from above. Ancient sources report that Cleopatra immediately tried to kill herself. She reached for a concealed dagger. The Roman soldiers were ready. They tackled her, wrestled the weapon away, pinned her down. According to Cassius Dio, she screamed that they would not take her alive to Rome. That line, whether exact or not, rings true because she knew exactly what Rome did with conquered rulers. The soldiers had direct orders. Keep her alive. Use whatever force is necessary. Do not let her die. They removed her from the tomb and took her to the royal palace under guard. A room was chosen for her confinement. Upper floor, one entrance, narrow window, hard to reach, easy to watch, easy to seal. No rope points, no obvious escape routes, no blades. And this is the moment when most retellings stop and leap straight to the final day. But the most important part of Cleopatra's death is what happened in between. Because Octavian did not merely need Cleopatra dead, he needed her to die after understanding exactly what she had lost. And before she died, he needed her to live long enough to become politically useful. To understand that, you need to understand Octavian's problem. He had won. Egypt was effectively his. Antony was dead. The wealthiest kingdom in the eastern Mediterranean was collapsing into Roman control. But in Rome itself, his victory still required explanation, because this had been, at its core, a civil war. Romans killing Romans. Octavian against Antony. That is dangerous politically. Civil war leaves scars, divided loyalties, complicated sympathies. Octavian needed to simplify the conflict into something morally easier, something the Roman public could celebrate without having to think too hard. So Antony had to become not a Roman rival with legitimate claims, but a man corrupted by the East. And Cleopatra had to become not a skilled ruler and political strategist, but the foreign temptation who had seduced a Roman hero away from his duty. That is the propaganda structure, and it only fully works if Cleopatra appears not as a complex monarch, but as a defeated symbol, a cautionary image, a spectacle. That is why Octavian needed her alive. Roman triumphs were not just parades, they were rituals of domination. Defeated kings, princes, and rebels were dragged through the streets of Rome in public humiliation, displayed before the crowd, then often executed afterward. The point was not merely to celebrate victory, the point was to convert the enemy into evidence. Evidence that resistance to Rome ended in total submission. Cleopatra knew this. She had seen Rome, she had lived there, she had witnessed Roman political theater up close. She would have known what had happened to Vercingetorix after Caesar's triumphs. She would have understood exactly what it meant to be saved alive for a Roman procession. So now we have the central conflict. Octavian needs Cleopatra alive to display her. Cleopatra would rather die than be displayed. What followed over the next 10 days was Rome trying to force that contradiction into a shape Octavian could use. The room in which she was held was stripped of anything dangerous. Sources suggest the Romans searched not only the chamber, but her clothing and her person repeatedly. Hair checked, garments examined, potential weapons removed, food monitored, visitors controlled. She was not allowed the intimacy of privacy, because privacy creates opportunity. She was not allowed the comfort of loyal companionship, because companionship creates planning. Her attendants, Eros and Charmian, who had been with her in the tomb, were separated. That detail matters more than people realize. Isolation is not just physical, it is strategic. Separate the queen from the two people most likely to help her preserve identity, ritual, and resolve. Let her hear them occasionally, perhaps, but not speak freely. Sound becomes another form of pressure, presence without contact, nearness without comfort. At the same time, Octavian needed to block every path to self-destruction. No obvious poison, no blade, no cord, no way to leap, no certainty. But preventing a suicide attempt was only half the job. He also needed to reshape her motivations. If Cleopatra wanted death because death protected dignity, then Octavian had to make life seem morally necessary. And this is where her children entered the machinery. Cleopatra had 4 children: Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar, about 17, and 3 younger children by Antony. Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus. The Romans separated them from her immediately, moved them elsewhere within palace control, kept them alive, visible and unreachable. Then came the messages, carefully phrased. Your children are safe, their future depends on your cooperation. If anything happens to you, no guarantees can be made. This was not random cruelty, it was precision. Because Cleopatra could endure humiliation for herself, what she could not easily dismiss was risk to her children, especially Caesarion. He was uniquely dangerous because he was Julius Caesar's biological son. Octavian's entire legitimacy rested on adoption and political inheritance. Caesarion's existence was a threat even if he never raised a sword. As long as he lived, someone could claim there was another Caesar. Cleopatra almost certainly understood this, which meant the threat worked on two levels at once, one maternal, one dynastic. If she died, Caesarion was vulnerable. If she lived, maybe she could bargain. Maybe. That word is enough to trap someone in hope, and hope can be more controlling than fear. So now Octavian had created a perfect bind. If Cleopatra died immediately, she preserved dignity, but abandoned her children to Roman mercy. If she lived and cooperated, she might save them, but at the cost of submitting to the humiliation she most feared. This is not just captivity. This is forced contradiction, a psychological cage built inside the physical one. Then the pressure escalated. According to accounts preserved through Plutarch and later writers, men connected with planning the triumph came to assess her, whether they were formerly architects in the modern sense or Roman officials discussing display mechanics. The point is the same. They measured height, physical proportions, presence, how she might appear in procession. What sort of display would carry the strongest symbolic impact? Imagine being Cleopatra and hearing men discuss your humiliation in practical terms, not as a possibility, as an event under construction. How tall, how visible, how arranged, how displayed. This was more than logistics, it was conditioning. Every measurement said the same thing. This is real. You are going to Rome. We are preparing the shape of your defeat. And they did not do it once. They returned, again and again, days structured around reminders that the triumph was approaching. Meanwhile, information about the children kept arriving in carefully controlled doses. Caesarion asked for you. The younger ones are safe. They need their mother. Do not do anything rash. This is how pressure becomes cyclical. Terror in one direction, hope in the other. Parade, children. Humiliation, children. Chains, children. A future only if you submit. By now Cleopatra was living in a state modern psychology would recognize immediately. Isolation, surveillance, deprivation of agency, emotional manipulation, and induced dependence on the very people orchestrating the threat. And she was not broken yet. That is what makes this period so revealing. She understood the structure. She knew what Octavian wanted. She also knew he was probably lying. But when the lie concerns your children, certainty becomes hard to hold. At some point during these days, sources suggest she stopped eating or reduced food significantly. The guards reported this. Octavian's response was not simply to force food into her. He changed the emotional equation. He reportedly allowed her a brief encounter with Caesarion, or at least some version of contact significant enough to revive hope. The exact details differ by source tradition, but the logic is clear. If she begins moving toward death again, put a child between her and that decision. Let the maternal instinct do the restraining. This is one of the darkest things about the whole story. Octavian did not need to torture Cleopatra physically in any dramatic way. He used love, he used hope, he used uncertainty, he used the human need to believe one still has leverage over the fate of those one loves. Then, after days of this, he came himself. Ancient writers indicate some form of direct meeting took place, though the exact wording is lost. But the broad terms are recoverable. Cooperate and preserve something. Resist and lose everything. Submit to the triumph and your children may live. Refuse and all consequences become possible. He did not need to shout. That is important. The most effective domination often does not need volume. By now the room itself was speaking for him. The guards, the searches, the measurements, the isolation, the withheld children, all of it made the offer legible before he ever voiced it. And from Cleopatra's perspective, the cruelty was sharpened by plausibility. Octavian was capable of mercy when mercy served him. He was also capable of total elimination when elimination served him better. She was dealing with a man who had already shown he understood politics as theater and human beings as symbols. He gave her time to think. That is another strategic move. A command imposes, a choice entangles. By telling her to decide, Octavian transformed captivity into participation. He made her partly responsible for the outcome. If she chooses wrongly, her children suffer. If she chooses humiliation, perhaps she saves them. This is how domination works at its most sophisticated. It recruits the victim's own conscience into the machinery. Then, somewhere around the final days, something changed. Maybe she overheard a guard. Maybe someone still loyal to her found a way to communicate. Maybe she simply understood enough Roman politics to see the lie more clearly over time. But at some point, Cleopatra appears to have realized the truth. Caesarion was not going to be spared, probably not under any circumstances. He was too dangerous, too symbolic, too useful dead. That realization would have changed everything. Because if the central promise collapses, then the entire logic of cooperation collapses with it. Now there is no bargain, only delay. And if there is no bargain, then death regains its meaning. At that point, sources report Cleopatra requested permission to visit Antony's tomb and make offerings before the journey to Rome. This was a clever request, because it sounded emotionally appropriate, politically harmless, and culturally legible. A grieving queen honoring the dead. Octavian allowed it under guard. Why not? The tomb had already been breached. She would be watched. Inside, for a brief period, she had access to a space not entirely under fresh Roman arrangement, and this is probably where the method of her death becomes less romantic and more practical. The famous asp story is memorable because it is symbolic. Egyptian royalty, snake iconography, a death by sacred emblem, but ancient writers themselves doubted parts of it. Strabo, writing relatively early, reports uncertainty. The physical symptoms later described do not perfectly match a large cobra bite. Snakes are unreliable, hard to control, hard to smuggle, hard to guarantee. Poison is cleaner. Poison hidden earlier in the tomb is plausible. A small container concealed in a wall niche or among funerary objects is plausible. Retrieving it during a supervised morning visit is plausible if the guards did not know exactly what to watch for. Then came the figs. She requested a meal, fresh fruit, something ordinary enough to pass inspection, memorable enough to carry legend afterward. The basket was searched. Nothing obvious was found, and whether poison came in with the food or had already been recovered at the tomb matters less than what happened next. Because on the morning of August 12th, the guards opened the chamber and Cleopatra was dead. She was not found collapsed in panic, not stripped of royal identity, not reduced to a broken prisoner in rags. She was arranged, dressed deliberately, placed on a couch in royal presentation, Iris dead nearby, Charmian still alive, according to Plutarch, using her last strength to adjust Cleopatra's diadem. That image matters, because it is the final refusal of Octavian's project. For 10 days he had tried to move Cleopatra from sovereign to exhibit, and in death she moved herself back. She died as queen, not as captive. She could not save her kingdom. She could not break Roman control. She could not rewrite what was coming. But she could deny him the living body he needed for the climax of his triumph. That was the last choice left, and she took it. Now comes the part history often softens, because it is too cold even for a Roman victory story. Octavian won anyway. He could not parade Cleopatra alive, so he manufactured the image, in his Roman triumph. An effigy, or representation of Cleopatra was carried through the streets, often described with a snake attached to her arm, fixing forever the image he wanted the Roman public to remember. Not the multilingual ruler, not the strategist, not the negotiator who had survived Caesar and allied with Antony, and held Egypt together under impossible pressure. No, the defeated Eastern queen, exotic, sensual, dangerous, destroyed, and because Rome controlled the narrative machinery, that image outlived the woman. Then Caesarion was killed. That detail is essential. The very child whose possible survival had likely been used to pressure Cleopatra was executed anyway, intercepted while fleeing, murdered on Octavian's orders. Julius Caesar's only biological son could not be allowed to exist in the new order. The younger children lived, but lived needs qualification. They were taken to Rome, displayed in the triumph in her place, raised under supervision, absorbed into Roman power. They survived as controlled remnants, not as free heirs of Egypt. So what then did Cleopatra's death achieve? That is the hardest question. If she died to save Caesarion, she failed. If she died to save all her children, she only partly succeeded, and even that through Roman custody. If she died to preserve the independence of Egypt, that too was already gone. What she protected was narrower, and in another sense immense. She protected one final act of self-determination. That sounds small until you understand how thoroughly Octavian had tried to eliminate it. He had confined her, isolated her, searched her, measured her, threatened her, used her children against her, promised futures he did not intend to grant, constructed a machine whose entire purpose was to leave her alive, but internally broken enough to participate in her own public humiliation. And she denied him that final step, not the victory, not the empire, not the propaganda, but that one particular satisfaction, the living Cleopatra in chains. For a ruler like Octavian, that mattered, because control is never just about outcomes, it is about visible compliance. He wanted not only her defeat, but her submission. Her death denied him the submission. So what happened in those 10 days? A romance? No. A glamorous suicide? No. A contest of wills in which one side held all the material power, and the other side was reduced, piece by piece, to one remaining choice. That is the story, and it tells us something enormous about power in the ancient world. The most effective rulers did not simply kill enemies, they staged them, measured them, redefined them, used family, ritual, humiliation, and narrative to convert human beings into political lessons. Octavian did not become Augustus merely because he won battles. He became Augustus because he understood that victory must be made legible. Cleopatra had to mean something useful when Rome looked at her, and because he could not fully control her body at the end, he controlled the story. For 2,000 years, the legend of the asp did part of his work for him. It made her death poetic instead of political, intimate instead of strategic, beautiful instead of calculated. That is what propaganda looks like when it lasts. And if this story unsettles you, it should, because what happened to Cleopatra is not ancient in the way people like to imagine ancient things. Safely distant, safely strange. The machinery is recognizable. Isolate, deprive, manipulate, weaponize loved ones, offer false choices, convert the victim into a public message, then narrate the whole event so beautifully that later generations mistake domination for destiny. Stand in Alexandria today, and you will not find the room. The palace is gone beneath the water, and the damage of centuries. The mausoleum is uncertain. The exact walls are lost. What remains are texts, fragments, Roman narratives, layered over Egyptian silence, and this 10-day gap where the real struggle happened. Not at Actium, not in the speeches, in a room, with one woman under guard, and an empire trying to decide what shape her ending should take. If this is the kind of history you come here for, subscribe to History Digger, and stay with me. We are going to keep pulling apart the myths that empire leaves behind. And in the comments, tell me this. Do you see Cleopatra's final act as a victory, a defeat, or the only possible form of resistance left to her? because that is the question that survives. She could not save Egypt. She could not save Caesar. She could not stop Octavian from remaking the story, but she could stop him from parading her alive. And sometimes, when all the large forms of power have been stripped away, the final choice is not whether you win, it is whether you will be used. Cleopatra chose not to be, and Rome has been trying to argue with that choice ever since.